It's now 7 o'clock, and I'm going to call the special meeting of the City of Oak Harbor Planning Commission, April 13, 2016. First off, I would like to introduce two newly appointed members of our commission. That would be Alyssa Merriman and Hal Hovey. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
And then the roll call, everyone is present except Commissioner Pierce. The first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes, March 22, 2016. Do I have a motion?
I move we accept the minutes as presented.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Minutes passed. Second item is the public comment. We reserve 15 minutes for the public to make comments other than what is on the agenda. Seeing not one person from the public here, I think I'll close that portion. Item 3 is the Marin Woods Planned Residential Development, PRD, and preliminary plat. It was a public hearing. The item has been postponed to a later date. Item 4, the 2016 Comprehensive Plan Update, public meeting. Dennis Lefebvre will take that for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the Commission, welcome to the new members of the Commission. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for this special meeting. While it's just dealing with one of the update elements of the comp plan, it's appreciated from staff's perspective because it gives us an opportunity to kind of space things out, gives us some time to prepare the information for you, as well as gives you an opportunity to thoroughly review the information rather than having it all backlogged up into a couple of meetings, which is really a cumbersome job for you folks. Tonight we are dealing with the environmental element, and the way I'd like to structure my discussion tonight is identify how that element fits into the Growth Management Act, and also discuss the element purpose. Why do we have the environmental element in our comprehensive plan? Take an opportunity to briefly review the three main categories of the goals that we have in the element. We have general goals. We have a set of goals that deal with environmental features. We have a set of goals that deal with the critical areas. I'd like to take a few minutes and just kind of walk through what some of the primary revisions were that we looked at as part of this element update, and then discuss with you the next steps that we have for this effort. As part of the Growth Management Act, which was passed in 1990, it was established at that time on 13 primary goals. One of the goals dealt directly with the environment, and it stated, protect the environment and enhance the state's high quality of life, including air and water quality and the availability of water. Since that time, I think the last couple of years, they added a 14th goal, which was for shorelines. Unlike the land use, housing, transportation elements, which CAC and myself have presented in the past, the environmental element is not a mandated element under growth management. However, it's probably a rare comprehensive plan for any community where you don't see that type of element addressed, either natural resource, resource management, or environmental element. Obviously, because the components of the element are extremely key for any jurisdiction. We also go further, and in the environmental element, we discuss a section for critical areas. Well, under the Growth Management Act, that was one area that was required of all jurisdictions at the time, was to identify and take steps to protect the critical areas of that community. So that was a requirement for under growth management for all jurisdictions. We obviously have that. I think it's codified in Title 20 of our municipal code. Basically, the purpose of our environmental element is to set up the framework of goals and policies that ensure that we protect and enhance our natural features. Maintain the visual and physical association with our marine waters. We have quite the amenity with our shoreline. And also preserve the health and special character of the city. Any environmental aspect, whether it be wetlands, the tree amenities that we have, add to the health and vitality of a community, and it's certainly an asset for any community to be able to enhance those amenities. In our element, we have basically overarching goals that we address. As part of Goal 1, we identify that we want to prevent adverse impacts to our natural features in critical areas. We encourage alternative methods of protection and stewardship. That's our Goal 2. We are required to utilize best available science when we are identifying and mapping out our critical areas. That's our Goal 7. And then also to streamline our environmental process so that we can incorporate the analysis of our environmental amenities into any type of development proposal.
May I stop you right there?
Yes, indeed, please do.
A minute ago, I thought I heard you say that this was not mandated. The environmental part is not mandated?
Right.
And then you just said we're required to.
Yeah, there's two pieces that we're dealing
Explain that to
with.
me.
With the comp plan, we have the environmental element, which sets goals and policies. What's required by the state is the regulation part that establishes critical areas, the 5 critical areas, which I'll address in a little bit. So the comp plan element is not a mandated element under the Growth Management Act, but establishing regulations to protect critical areas in our code is.
Thank you.
Yep. So let's see, we've done the general goals. We have a set of goals in the element that deal with environmental features, not necessarily critical areas, but environmental features which we think are a benefit to our community, so we need to address that through the establishment of Goal 3, which deals with water quality, stormwater management. If you've noticed, we've incorporated some language in there that links it to low-impact development techniques, which is something that we're going to be addressing a little bit further on as we move that process along. Air quality. The urban forest. We've addressed the urban forest because there's some amenities in our community which are special to us, and that's the Gary Oaks. And we include some policies that deal with retention, replacement of trees and vegetation so that we maintain that quality in our community. As we all know, we have a pretty rich historic and cultural resource amenity in our community as well, so we address that in Goal 6. And then the shorelines, kind of the jewel of our area is the shorelines, and that's addressed in Goal 14. The last component of our goals section in this element deal directly with the critical areas, and that's Goals 9 through 13. There are 5 critical areas that were identified at the state level, which we've incorporated into this element. Deals with wetlands, fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. That's an opportunity for us, which we've taken to deal with species of local significance, like our Gary Oaks, that we can protect through policy setting and then convert that into code. Geologically sensitive areas, we do have some landslide areas, some potentially seismic areas. Frequently flooded areas, we deal with that through Goal 12. We do have some flooded areas or flooding potentially areas along the water. And then, of course, the critical aquifer recharge areas. We do address that in our Goal 13. Essentially, what we did as part of our update for this element was to look at the goals, look at the policies, and dealing with the goals primarily, we didn't change any of the goals drastically. As you can tell in that version that was part of your packet that showed strike through and underlines, we didn't really change much of the goals. We did some wordsmithing, we did some condensing, but we didn't make any substantive changes to the goals. In fact, the number of goals, 14, remains the same as it is now. As far as policies, again, as you can tell in that version, I'm not going to go into any details. Certainly, I would be happy to if you had questions on any specific policies. but I know this is a first touch. Again, we did some wordsmithing, just for condensation, making it a little bit easier to read, that type of thing. We did some removal of policies where we thought it was appropriate or that the action that it was recommending was already dealt with or established. For instance, 1D, I think, dealt with the establishment of a critical areas overlay. That's in code already, so we felt that policy wasn't really necessary to have in that goal. We did create a few new policies. In Goal 2, there was quite a discussion that dealt with alternative methods of resource protection and stewardship. And we felt there was enough value in those statements to take them out of a discussion item and then actually create a policy under Goal 2 that addressed those types of actions. Probably the biggest piece of the element that we have changed, and that's in keeping with the other elements that we've already addressed and brought forward to you, including land use, transportation, the housing element. There's pieces of discussion items, often through the element and after policies, it goes into a discussion on why that policy is in place. Well, we have moved in the direction of removing some of those discussion items simply because either they're redundant, not necessary, it just basically takes more effort than not to have that in the element. So we've decided to remove those in most cases. In the draft that I have submitted to you, where I've removed the discussion items, I've basically indicated why those have been removed. In some cases, there was some discussion items we as staff felt that there was a value to, or maybe there was another piece that we wanted to work forward on that was encompassed in the discussion item. We moved that into the last section, which is consistent again with the previous elements that addressed opportunities and challenges. There was only a couple of those areas that we actually did that for. So essentially, that's what we have done with this element. I tried to provide both versions of the draft to you, the one that showed the full strikeout and underline, and then also a clean version, which sometimes is easier to read. And I'd certainly be happy to entertain any questions or comments on that. Next steps for this element, as I mentioned, this is basically your first touch on this, so we'll give you an opportunity to look through it in the next couple of weeks and review it. We'll have other opportunities to receive any comments you may have on this element through our discussion on the April 26th meeting, and of course during the public hearing there's always opportunities for you to make comments on this draft as well. Subsequent to the comp plan update, we will be looking at our critical areas ordinance. There's a couple of areas in there that we need to address to stay consistent with the requirements of the state. One particular area is the wetland buffer area. We'll have to readjust what we have for buffers on our wetlands, make it consistent with the state requirements. So that is my presentation for this evening, and certainly if you have any questions, the photos were courtesy of CAC and AHBL, by the way, so give them their just due. I'd be happy to respond to any questions.
I have some questions.
Okay.
I just kind of read through the entire policy. I thought you guys did a really good job of editing and revising and taking out the redundancy, and I love the clean version. It's definitely consistent with the other policies that we're working on. So as a commissioner, review it, it's easier to dive in and kind of dissect the areas you want to focus on because they're all similar. So I just have a couple clarification questions
Okay.
on some items. I'm going to start on existing environmental conditions. So
What page are you on?
I'm on page 70,
Okay.
actually 71. So on page 71, there's some bulleted items there that talk about the UGA included in this element. And one of those talks about the fish and wildlife habitat. I'm just curious, we identified some specific fish and wildlife species, but there's other places in the policy where that's more general. And it even talks about, let me find that other piece and then my thought will make sense. It talks about one of the goals or one of the policies under Goal 10 is to identify priority species. So I'm just curious if we need to be specific in that section. If we are specific, are then we excluding other habitat? Should it be more general? Just kind of a question for you.
No, I think that was an opportunity for us to give more definition to these specific areas, not wanting to exclude any other significant habitat, but just an opportunity to go into a little bit more detail and definition of
Kind of
those specific
highlighting
areas.
like we did the Gary Oak trees.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Could add to that, the ones which are listed on page 71 are ones that we know that we already have to address because they've already been identified as those priority
Oh,
species.
okay.
So eelgrass is something that we have to pay attention to out in the harbor, as is shellfish. The forage fish spawning areas are things that we're required to pay attention to, as are the other things which are listed there. So those are known entities to us, and the policy tells us that as those lists get changed by those agencies which have jurisdiction, we have to be paying attention to that and then incorporate that new information into our code as it becomes available.
Thank you. I have another question.
Okay.
Goal 1, Policy 1B, update and maintain inventories of all critical areas. What is the frequency on the updating and the maintenance of those critical areas? Is it annually? Is it as needed?
I know.
Steve?
Steve, for 100.
The answer is it depends. So we do it on a major update cycle if information is available to us. But the way that you really keep those inventories updated is when we get development applications, which then are also required to provide to us a particular critical area study. And so each of those then becomes part of our body of knowledge. And so generally, when we look at other outside sources, the maps are generalized. There's kind of sort of a wetland in this area. And then when somebody who has a piece of property in that area develops, they'll do a site-specific wetland study, and we'll learn a little bit more about the boundary of the wetland in that area. And then each of those builds our body of knowledge. And then generally at the major update cycle, we will revise the maps to reflect that new body of knowledge.
Thank you. I have another question. Does
Okay.
anybody else have any other
You're doing
questions?
good, go.
Goal number 2, policy 2H says, consider establishing a wetland mitigation bank to increase wetland values and encourage efficient land use. I felt like the word consider is a little bit loose, and I thought that type of policy might be better in that final area where we talk about our opportunities and challenges, because how do we measure the consideration of a policy within a goal? It's just my thought.
Good point. Steve, do you have any comments on that?
You know, the wetland mitigation bank is a tough thing. I think we could easily move that policy to the opportunities and challenges section. It takes an awful lot of resources to implement and to manage a wetland bank, and then to implement a process by which those credits are bought and sold. At one time, the city, I think, really thought that they would undertake that in the Friend Marsh area. I think in some sense we're past that thinking, but at the staff, when we talked about it, we thought, you know, it's not completely out of the realm of possibilities, so we kept it. But if it's better suited in sort of the opportunities or challenges section, if it's too imprecise here for the commission's taste, then we could certainly move it.
Yeah, I think it's a good policy. I just wasn't sure how we'd really measure something like that, and I don't want to omit it completely, so I thought it might be better
Good
in
suggestion.
that area.
Commissioner Wise? Since goal 2 in and of itself is we are encouraging alternative methods, and lots of them encourage, they say encourage a lot. So then considering is part of encouraging, so I kind of think it fits in there because it's something we're thinking about, but we haven't necessarily brought it forward as something we're going to spend money on, I think, or it's something we're.
I can see that, except the way
Yeah.
that I interpret encourage is that can be measurable activity. So if we're encouraging a certain activity, we can then measure that after a certain period of time. Like 2D, encourage regulatory options such as zoning and subdivision. We would actually see then regulatory options with zoning and subdivision.
Right.
But if we're just considering something, it's more of a thought and it's not tangible, just from my perspective.
Right, yeah. And sometimes we only want to consider, we don't want to go forward too. So I guess that's just kind of how it all fits together, is whether, I get your point though.
Yeah, I like the language.
Yeah.
I just felt like as a policy, it's not something we can really measure. So
Oh.
it's just me and my own
No.
personal.
No, it's cool, I
have another question.
Okay.
Goal 3, policy 3B, we talk about updating the comprehensive storm drainage plan. There's a couple other areas that we talk about updating something, but we include the words update and maintain. I'm wondering if that should be similar language. Is that something that would require maintenance as we get more information, or if the stormwater management manual changes, would then we need to update and maintain?
So we're on a cycle on both of those. The storm drainage plan does not have a state mandated timeframe. For instance, the water system plan that we do has a state mandated timeline by the Department of Health. The storm drain plan doesn't have that same timeline, but it has essentially a shelf life. We try not to go much longer than 6 or 7 years with that particular document, which is about the same as most of our other master utility plans. The Stormwater Management Manual for Western Washington is the one which gets updated by the Department of Ecology. The one prior to the 2012 was the 2005 manual, and it does not happen on a regular interval. But when it happens, then we usually have a couple of years before then we have to adopt that and implement it. So, for instance, we're getting ready right now to adopt the 2012 manual by the end of this calendar year. So they both have timelines, but they're both different. And the language here, I think
you answered my question,
Yeah.
because when we're talking about maintaining the critical areas, that's because we're getting new information as each of those studies are happening. So that's
Right.
actually what we're maintaining.
we're
This-
maintaining our body of knowledge based
Yeah.
upon that information that's coming in. In this case, what we really are saying is that we need to update our master plan for stormwater, certainly on our own schedule, but then once we have a new manual from the state, then we have to put that new manual into.
Within that specified time frame.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have some more questions. When we're talking about water quality, there were some really good policies in here. I didn't see anything about testing the water quality or sharing that information with the public. Is that covered in another element or another plan?
Are we talking about stormwater quality?
No, still goal number 3, so preserve and enhance water quality in conformance with Puget Sound's partnership. Just in general, there wasn't anything about water quality testing, and I know we do that.
We do. It's actually sort of a split responsibility. Island County Health does stormwater testing, and they also test water in the harbor. They do it somewhat on a periodic basis, but then they also do it when they believe there's some sort of activity that requires them to figure out what's going on. And so that's where, whether it's here or someplace else, from time to time you'll see a beach closure. It's because as part of their periodic testing, they've determined that the coliform level is too high or something like that. In we are required under our stormwater permit through the state of Washington to either do our own stormwater quality testing or pay into a fund and have the state do it. It is far more efficient for us to pay into the fund and have the state of Washington do it so that we don't have to maintain that whole level of expertise on staff. And so on an annual basis, we pay X amount of dollars, and then DOE does that testing at points that they determine out in the harbor. Beyond that, we obviously test our sewer effluent because we're required to do that under a whole separate set of permitting processes, and that's another section that I guess sort of relates to this because we test at our outfalls to make sure that we're within the limits of our permit.
I'm going to think about that one.
Okay.
That was a good answer. I just was thinking about some other things when you were. Okay, I'm going to ask you a question again.
Sure.
So we're paying the state to do the testing on an annual basis. Could that be considered as a policy meeting this goal number 3, just so it's transparent, so the public knows that that's happening? Does that support preserving and enhancing the water quality?
Well, it does because it's a requirement of our, and I'll throw some acronyms at our new planning commissioners, at our NPDES Phase 2 permit, which is a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. And that's the stormwater permit. Okay, so when you hear us talk about that, it's the stormwater permit. And we're under that permit, and part of that requires us to do some of the things that Dennis has talked to you before about, the LID, the low impact development techniques and all those kinds of things. Another part of that requires us to run our operations in a certain fashion, and yet another part of it requires us to either do that water testing ourselves or to pay them. And so it is a direct permit requirement that we have to do. I don't know whether that gets to the transparency so much that you're maybe thinking about, because we don't really have a choice. We're stuck with that requirement.
Okay.
Now, if we can figure out how to get credit for it, we're all for it, and we'll figure out how to put it in here. Yeah.
The new planning commissioners will realize we are full of acronyms.
I have a couple more questions.
Never yield the floor, Jess, just keep on going.
So I just kind of want to have a conversation so that I have a good understanding of how we define maintaining and improving air quality in this setting. Is this just as it relates to environmental hazards? And specifically what I'm talking about is the noise and kind of the conversations that are happening amongst the city about the impact of our, outlying field. So I don't see anything in the policy that relates to noise when it comes to air quality. So I'm just curious about how that fits in. Does that fit in?
This is specifically directed at air quality in the sense of
That we're ingesting.
what is the quality of the air that we are all breathing.
Okay,
Yeah.
that answers my question.
And we do address that to some degree in the transportation element
Yes.
too, where we're promoting, the multimodal transit type usage as well.
To reduce pollution
Exactly,
okay,
yep.
perfect. One more question. We talk a lot about the Shoreline Management Act, and because I get to volunteer my time in different places, I'm curious how this kind of goes back to the new Windjammer Park integration plan, and they're kind of talking about redefining that shoreline. I'm sure that group has evaluated the shoreline management plan, and it's all consistent with their developmental approach.
Short answer is yes. They would not propose something which would not fit within the context of our obligations under the Shoreline Management Act, or SMA, is what you'll hear a lot. And then the implementing tool is the Shoreline Master Program, or SMP. So there are, in a sort of a thumbnail sketch, there are some things that are automatically okay to be doing within the shoreline area, which is the first 200 feet back from the ordinary high water mark. There are some things which are automatically a bad idea to do, and we really can't do, and then there's things in the middle. And all of the things which are shown in the concepts for the Windjammer Park Integration Plan would fall into either the things which are automatically okay, or the things which can be okay if you do them in the right fashion.
Thank
Yeah.
you. I have one more question. It's not really a question, it's a comment about a word. It's under goal number 2, policy 2J, providing incentives, which is great, tax incentives, density credits. The word flexibility of the city's development regulations. I don't like that word very much, because when are we flexible and when are we perceived to be inflexible? And is there a different word that we could use, or was the team really happy with that word?
Well, we could potentially use a different word. I think why it's flexible is, when dealing with development regulations, inherently in having those some options for a developer that they could potentially utilize. For instance, I think, Steve, in our PRD, we have some additional density allocations if they preserve a certain amount of the site, and those are kind of the flexibilities that are inherent in the code.
I mean, like option A, B, and C, you could do one or the above.
Yes, yeah.
So maybe could we just say density credits and various options within the city's developmental regulations?
Options would be fine. I think that would get the point across. Because probably the classic way to think about it is most development regulations have a fixed number, right? So if we're talking about setbacks on a piece of property, it's not generally written, it's somewhere between 20 and 23 feet, it's 20 feet, right? Or it's 25, or it's 15. In a setting when you have a critical area present, in order to preserve a portion of that critical area on your property, we may be able, through the code, and that latitude is written in there. It says, well, we can reduce setback by up to X amount if it helps preserve that critical area. So maybe there's a 20-foot setback that if adhered to would mean the building would encroach into the critical area, but because we're trying to protect the critical area, we can reduce that 20 feet to 10 feet and do it administratively as opposed to going through a hearing process. So that's the flexibility that it's getting at. But options would work. There could be other word choices as well. But if I'm hearing what you're really sort of asking about is it done willy-nilly or in an arbitrary and capricious fashion? And the answer, of course,
wouldn't assume that.
Yeah, I
ever,
understand, but you're asking the question for the benefit of the public.
Yes.
So are there guidelines that we have to try to operate under, or is it, flip of the coin kind of thing? And that's not really obviously what we do. Those parameters are provided to us in the code.
And I was thinking, if I'm reading this independently and I'm not referencing back to the code to see those options, then as a citizen, I might make an assumption that sometimes our city is flexible and sometimes they may not be.
Be inflexible.
Yeah, so I just
Yeah.
didn't like the
Yeah.
word. That's all.
Very
I'm
good.
done. That's all.
Thank you.
So what we might explore is something that maybe works with the idea of options, maybe, Dennis?
Yeah.
And maybe somehow we can tie it back to the first word, which is provide, and
Provide.
think about how we can make it clear that the regulations provide choices
Yes.
to help preserve the critical areas.
Yeah.
Well,
Will
what if
do.
you just said, and flexibility within the city's developmental regulations? Because then you're operating within your regulations, but that you have, it's not like option A is you have to go back, because I'm worried about the option part. If option A is you got to go back 3 feet here and 2 feet here, but that doesn't fit in that development, then you do have to be flexible to get your proper amount in. So if you're flexible within the code, it's different than having set options. Does that make sense?
I appreciate the concept of the flexibility that's offered within the code, but I think the word flexible is the wrong word in this context. Whereas if we put the
Well,
word
the word within is
options,
not in there now. That's why I was offering that as it just says flexibility of, and if you say flexibility within, then if you know you have to have X number of feet, but it can be flexible whereupon the plat it is.
but my objection
I understand your
is
objection.
not the word within, it's specifically the word flexible. Because if we put options, then the citizen could come back and say, where are my options? Oh, your options are in the code. So then we're kind of cross-referencing and it's all fluid. And again, it's just my own personal opinion, but I really dislike the word flexible as it relates to a regulation because there could be a perception that we're inflexible. That was just my own.
Staff will work to.
2 cents.
Staff will work to take the comments of the commission and see if we can figure out how to provide some clarity here.
Yeah.
I think just having worked in that kind of environment before, some things in a code are inflexible. You have to be, X this, but there also has to be flexibility so that a developer doesn't have to have, every development doesn't look the same. I went over to Ocean Shores and looked at one of their low-impact little developments they've built along the ocean on the bluffs, and if there was no flexibility. There was no flexibility. And so that's kind of why I think sometimes it's got to be, you have to have on this page, we could have many different things. And an option to me isn't flexible because an option is what somebody else decided I already needed. So it takes away my creative ability within my map. And I get your point, but I hope you would.
So it might be
take
helpful
mine
for
too.
staff to maybe just
Yeah.
expand on this topic for a minute, since we have just a little bit of time. So if we think about the hierarchy of all these things that we have that are working, so we have the goals and policies, which are giving us that guiding direction. And in the context of what we're talking about, so we have environmental goals and policies, and then we're going to have the critical areas codes. And those critical area codes work with the code from the underlying zoning district. So if we're talking about a residential zoning district, then we're talking about the residential setbacks for that individual house or that individual plat. And those apply in a uniform fashion, except when that critical area is present. And then within the code, we have essentially different options almost, or different hierarchy of things that we go through. So if you want to just preserve the critical area exactly the way that it is and just draw a big buffer around it, you can do that. And then the code says the density that would have been underneath where that wetland is now gets to get pushed out somewhere else within the plat. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. So that's sort of the first tier. If that doesn't work for you, and because of land and configuration, and you want to shrink in the buffer in one area, but you have to make it bigger in another area, because we have a concept called buffer averaging, and that works and that will change the configuration around there. We have a provision that allows you to reduce that buffer if you do X, Y, and Z somewhere else in the plat. So they work hand in glove together, and we work with that particular property owner to go through that list of things to figure out, or they figure out which one they think works best for their project. So it's, I guess in a sense it's options. Dennis, would you think that they are options or different code provisions?
I think there could be options in there. Certainly,
Yeah.
you can see development that comes in and decides, well, okay, we can do the buffer averaging as part of our project that would benefit them, and it would also meet one of our criteria. That's an option that.
And the
would
part that
be
I've left
presented.
out of that is, so there's a series of choices that could be made, and those are handled administratively between us and the developer or the property owner. If none of those work for whatever reason, or they feel that they don't work, then there are at least two other options that they can pursue that involve the hearing examiner. So we moved from the administrative side of it into the public hearing side of it, and seek some form of relief that we don't have the authority to grant, but that the hearing examiner could. So there's a whole, it's a menu, if you will. Think of it as a menu of things that could apply to a particular piece of property.
So I just want to clarify my thought because I don't want to be misunderstood. I appreciate that we're flexible, but the way that I would summarize that is that there's options within the code that give us flexibility. Flexibility doesn't create options that aren't in accordance with the code. So that word flexibility, you can interpret it many ways if you're reading this document as a standalone document and you're not doing your research to see how it supports the code that we have in place.
We will
Yeah,
figure out a way to provide some clarity
I
to
love
this
being
document.
Exactly.
flexible. I'm flexible.
Your point is appreciated.
I do agree.
yeah.
I think that when you take it from that approach, that, a developer could come and say, well, your 4 options aren't very flexible. I want you to be flexible, and I don't like any of your 4 options. Sure. So I do agree with her.
Okay, we'll figure out how to provide some extra clarity to that.
Good.
Thank you, Dennis.
Oh, you bet.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you, Steve, for answering my questions.
Dennis, I actually like the fact that you removed so many words.
Yes.
I mean, you removed a lot of words, and I think that's great because all those words in your discussion, open somebody's mind going in a different direction than what the code says. And it's fewer words said or fewer words printed, you're better off. And I'm used to a code, if it says it, you can do it, you can. If it doesn't say you can do it, you can't. Subject to a variance or a conditional use permit of that, that nature. So I was very pleased. And another point too is we've all noticed a lot of logging trucks and a lot of clear cutting across the city, and I've had the option to, the ability to stop and walk through some of these lands where used to be trees, but now they're nothing but cut down trees. And they're north and south and central, they're all over the place. And you see different things that are there that you didn't even know were there before. And a lot of them are wetlands. And buildings you never could see, even if you were 10 feet away from them, because the thicket were just so bad, they're just so strong, old growth and that. And also a lot of hazards, let's put it that way. But I think the fewer words we have, the better off we are, as long as we comply. But most people, when they're looking at something like this, they don't know to reference something else because all of this stuff is in another document as well. Because the SMP, the NPDES, all of that applies. It just, if you bring that into the document, it muddies the water. That's the way I see it.
And that's been staff's philosophy all through these elements, even though some of those discussion pieces are very well written.
Right.
And do include some information. It's not consistent with how we've been dealing with the other elements.
I was trying to use it as well. I live in a PRD and it's got 10,000 square foot lots, it's got 5,000 square foot lots, it's got 7,200, where it's all supposed to be one size, but there's different tax advantages, for the developer. Options, advantages, that's the way I look at it, because from a developer standpoint, they're looking to make a profit. And so that's why I like the word advantage, because it allows me to work within the system, work within the flexibility of the code itself, with respects to square footage of lots, the height restrictions and things like that. But a lot of it, that's what it's about, is to get somebody to come in and build within our regulations, but also give some flexibility within, the particular code that the property is in.
Exactly.
And I've seen that used very, very well in some of the projects that are being developed as we speak. And it becomes more important, with what's in front of us, the next couple of years, with the housing issues and things like that. So
Yes.
I was very pleased with the document overall.
Oh, thank you. And again, you will have an opportunity to read it again if you'd like, and then bring back some more comments.
I expect that.
The next couple of meetings, it will always be open for
forward to that.
receiving more comments.
Actually, you don't have a choice. You have to read it again because we're going to give it to you again.
I do have a question. Item 3F, I think I understand most of the words in that sentence, and I kind of understand the way that they're tied together, but I'm stuck on two words, and that is rate conditions. I don't understand what pre-development rate conditions means. I can understand if it said pre-development rate or pre-development conditions, but I don't understand what.
That is a little offline. I think what they're saying here is that you want to deal with the stormwater management rate is
The rate
not
refers
correct.
to the flow rate of
Okay.
the water. So, pre-development rate condition, when they model it, when they do the modeling, they're required to go back to a pre-development status for that property. And so essentially, it's way back in time when it was all forested. And so that's the pre-development, and the rate condition is really supposed to address how fast that water is coming and how much water is coming off of that property in that pre-development condition. And they have to match that in their post-development. Actually, after the development occurs, they can only release the water at the rate that it would have come off of it if it wasn't developed at all. It probably is a little cumbersome in terms of the language. I don't know that there's anything magical about it. We could probably do without the word condition, actually. Pre-development rate in new developments and substantial redevelopment projects.
So just so that I understand what it is it's saying, let's say that the flow off a particular parcel is, during a typical rainstorm is 1,000 gallons per minute. I mean, it could come off as a sheet, or it could come off down a stream, a natural stream. And the conditions are significantly different. But the rate is the same over the parcel. So are you saying that they need to replicate a stream on that parcel?
No,
Or
what
you
they
have to
do-
just maintain the 1,000 gallons per minute?
Right, so
Yes.
it goes back to the pre-settlement times is another phrase that you'll see. So you're thinking forested conditions with lots of undergrowth, essentially before man was on the land. And so what happens in terms of how much water would be coming off of that? And obviously, you're absolutely right. You put your finger on one of the tough parts is that there's a big difference when it comes off just naturally in a sheet versus when it gets concentrated. And so the pre-development condition is how much water would come off of that 200 years ago versus what it would be today, but it can't come off any faster than what it was 200 years ago. And I'm using that number just as an example.
Wouldn't flow work in that case? It really, if you look at the word rate,
It could be flow rate.
You know what I would suggest is the very simple thing for us to fix in here is for us to consult with our stormwater expert on the city staff, which is Brad Gluth, and he could give us some guidance as to what's the best policy language in here without so the point comes across, but without complicating the policy itself. So it's a good question.
Okay, thank you.
Just to maybe tie some of the pieces together, part of what happens in 3F is mandated through the Stormwater Management Manual, the 2012 manual, and our adherence to that is what's mandated through the NPDES Phase 2 permit. So it all ties together, or dare I say, it all flows together.
And that's part of the problem with all the different regulations, because you have to jump or know where to go. But when it's in development stages, you're given that information as the checklist. Okay, does it or does it not? And it tells you where to go to, to make sure.
And that,
Some years back, I actually bought a house, and I thought it was at this one level, and when it finally got approved by the county, it was 300 feet above the level that I thought it was gonna be. And we moved in the first year, they had almost like a 100-year storm, and the water came through, and there was a big ravine down in the back in a parkland-type atmosphere. And the water washed 30 feet from the back of my house where it was 300 feet on not only my house, but 11 houses along that road. The water came down so horrific, and they didn't allow for that. And it just couldn't, I mean, it just basically came off and just straight down. So that's why I understand a lot of that stuff. So it's just unbelievable, the flow rate for that 100-year.
The main goal of the policy is for us to say that in new projects or substantial redevelopment, there has to be some sort of facility which is limiting the velocity and the quantity as it's coming off of that piece of property at a controlled rate. That's a word that words we hear together. It's a controlled rate to avoid the situation that Mr. Freeman is describing.
Any other questions?
Commissioners, any other? Since this is the only item, and if we're complete as I know it right now, I guess we will call the meeting adjourned.
And again, we thank you for your time tonight on a special meeting. We think it'll be worthwhile to you so that you don't get a giant document in a month and a half. Yeah.